Okay, let's talk about assortment of goods under the UCC. And we're looking at this question number 18. Okay, so let's say the rule first. Assortment of goods. The buyer possesses the duty to specify the assortment of goods unless the parties' agreement lacks a relevant provision. Who possesses the duty to specify the goods? The buyer. When there's no provision. Okay, so if the buyer's failure to specify the assortment of goods materially affects the seller's performance of the contract, the seller consider this failure a breach of the contract because the buyer failed to accept the agreed upon goods. Okay, let's shorten that. Who possesses the duty to specify the assortment of goods? The buyer. When is this duty triggered? When the party doesn't have a provision that specifies the assortment. Okay, let's take a look at this. A seller and a buyer entered into a written contract providing that the seller was to deliver 1,000 cases of candy bars to the buyer during the months of May and June. Under the agreement, the buyer was obligated to make a selection by March 1st of the quantities of the various candy bars to be delivered under the contract. Okay, so the buyer has a duty here to make a selection regarding the assortment of goods. Okay, so now the buyer didn't make the selection by March 1st. And on the next day, March 2nd, the seller notified the buyer that because of the buyer to select, the buyer would not deliver the candy bars. He had all the candy bars on hand. He didn't make any additional sales. And on March 2nd, the seller says, hey, I won't perform. The buyer notified the seller. This is my selection and insisted the seller perform, and the seller refused. Okay, let's go to part 2 of the rule. If the buyer's failure to specify the assortment of goods materially affects the seller's performance of the contract, the seller can consider this a failure and a breach. When is it a breach? When he fails to accept the agreed on goods. Okay, here, what do we have? We have 4 choices. If the buyer sues the seller for breach of contract, will the buyer prevail? No, because a contract didn't exist. No, under the UCC, a contract existed. Okay, this kind of looks like an express condition. But under the UCC, the buyer's failure to specify the assortment has to be a material breach, right? Okay, so the seller doesn't have any duty to make a reasonable selection. That duty falls to the buyer. Part 2 of the rule, if the buyer's failure to specify the goods materially affects the seller's performance of the contract, the seller doesn't have a duty to select. The buyer does. So that's out. It's an express condition. That looks tempting. But here we have material breach. What's a material breach? If the buyer's failure to specify the assortment materially affects the seller's performance of the contract, then it's a breach. Is a delay of 1 day a material breach? Okay, probably not. And look here. C, a delay of 1 day in making the selection did not have a material effect on the seller. They're giving you the rule right here. All right, and that's it.